Yes, good, right. It's back to the real world. Hello, everybody. Now, today's session is going to be chaired by Sean. So I'll pass over to Sean in a moment. But I'll just tell you about next time.
Get my
fortnight's time. I forgot where we are. March 14th. That must be the next one. We have Lewis Jones, Felicity Greenland, Martin Nail, and Martin Graber talking for us. So that's March the 14th. That's in a fortnight. And then the fortnight after that is our special on sea songs, which Martin Graber's putting together. April the 11th, we won't have a meeting. Well, we're going to miss one because the week after that and 3 weeks running, we'll have our conference, the Folk Voice. So we've got 2 more of these fortnightly meetings. Then we miss one on April the 11th. And then there's the Folk Voice for 3 weeks running in April and May. So keep an eye on the newsletter, which will be coming out during the week. And that'll give you all the dates so that you don't get confused, which some of us are bound to. So
and
it's good.
And it's on the website as well.
And on the website, of course. I forget the website. There are websites out there. So thanks, everybody, for coming. As always, we sold out. So we've got a really good audience out there. And over to you, Sean, for today's session.
Good. Thank you, Steve. So my welcome to everybody. We've got a lovely, warm, sunny spring day. So I hope you're enjoying something similar wherever you are. And I'm not going to witter on at all because our speakers this afternoon, we've got all sorts of fascinating subjects as well as fascinating people to hear from. So I'm going to hand over pretty much immediately to Leela Weinstein, who I know is going to tell us something about who sounds like a remarkable and also a delightful man. So Leela, if you are ready, it would be lovely to hear from you.
Okay, thank you so much, Sean, and thank you also to Martin and Steve. I'm happy to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, oh, this is not at the beginning. Hang on. Words in this. Sorry, folks. Got a preview of the middle of it here. Hang on. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about Bascom Lamar Lunsford. By way of explanation, I work at Mars Hill University, which is in Madison County, North Carolina. And our Southern Appalachian Archives here is where Lunsford bequeathed a lot of his collections. And those collections include memorabilia, instruments, a song collection, and also a set of enormous scrapbooks that follow his musical life. And some of the songs and all of the scrapbook have actually been digitized and are online, and there's a link to those at the end of the presentation. So I've been spending the last couple of weeks going through his boxes, and I'm also starting on an oral history project, interviewing folks that knew him and who still have strong memories of him. So Bascom Lamar Lunsford was born in 1882 here in Madison County, North Carolina. Madison County is very rural and mountainous and is in the far west of the state, right up against the Tennessee border. Famously, the county is home to Cecil Sharp's Nest of Singing Birds from his 1916 Southern Appalachian trip where he recorded Jane Gentry. We're looking at a newspaper clipping right now that Lunsford saved that reads, "Miss Gentry collecting folk songs of mountains just like her mother." And this newspaper clipping is referring to one of Jane Gentry's daughters, who was also collecting songs. It's also home to the ballad singers from the community of Sodom Laurel. Some of you are no doubt familiar with Deli Norton and Sheila K. Adams, who's the great niece of Deli Norton. Here we're looking at Deli Norton and her sister Brazil Wallen at the Bard Ray Folk Festival in the late 1970s, and I believe they're also in their late 70s here. Lunsford is interesting in that he had one foot in both worlds. He was himself a traditional musician. He grew up playing the fiddle, the banjo, dancing, and singing. But he was also a collector and promoter of folk music and of festivals and dance. He grew up very much ensconced in rural life and in community events where music would have been played, molasses boilings, bean stringings, corn shuckings. His family on his mother's side was quite musical. He had an uncle who was a renowned fiddler in the region, and his mother was a ballad singer. And we're looking at an image of Bascom probably in the early 1900s, and also one of his mother. He had a remarkable life, a rather extraordinary life. It included 2 long marriages, 7 children, being sort of mentored by Robert Winslow Gordon, recording for Frank C. Brown, and performing for the Roosevelts and the King and Queen of England. And we're looking at a letter at the bottom there from Mrs. Roosevelt thanking him for performing there, and also an image of Frank C. Brown that he had saved after Brown recorded him. The folklorist Dorothy Scarborough worked with Lunsford on her 1930 collecting trip to Western North Carolina, and she described him, quote, as having a boyish, open countenance, springy step, and in his eye that light of insanity, which denotes the folklorist. So I find him quite an intriguing character, sort of a mixture of fierce and tender. For much of his adult life, he lived on a farm in South Turkey Creek, which is right next door to Madison County. And we're looking at an image of him sitting on his farm outside playing the banjo. He had a dizzying number of professions. A partial list of those professions includes he was a nursery fruit tree salesman. He sold bees and honey. He was a supervisor at a school for the deaf. He was a lawyer. He was a college professor of English and history and a newspaper editor and publisher. And that's really just some of the things that he did. But of all of his professions, his great love, and he actually referred to it as his calling, was the music and dance of the Southern Appalachian Mountains. He really devoted much of his life to playing traditional music, performing it, collecting it, promoting it, fostering musicians, and also organizing and advising on music festivals. His musical legacy comes to us in the forms of the songs and tunes that he left us, also the folk festivals that he influenced and created, and also the dance traditions that he fostered. I'm not going to go into the dance traditions today because it's its whole own very long but very interesting story. So we'll talk about the first 2. So his songs. Lunsford has left us with thousands of songs and also banjo, fiddle tunes, and dances, but a lot of songs that would have been circulating orally in Western North Carolina, and also some in other parts of the South in the first few decades of the last century. And those songs come to us in the form of commercial recordings. We're looking at a cover of an LP of his songs, but also 2 memory collections, one that he did in 1935 for Columbia University, and another one that he did in 1949 for the Library of Congress. And each of those have around 312 or 315 songs, ballads, songs, games and rhymes, play party songs on them. But he also has left us literally thousands of handwritten and typed lyric sheets and notebooks. And we're looking here at some handwritten songs that he collected, a version of Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, and also Farewell, My Dearest Dear, both from counties in Western North Carolina. His songs came from his family and his immediate community, but also from people all over Western North Carolina and a little bit of upstate South Carolina. Remember, he spent time selling fruit trees and bees and honey, so he traveled around. And he would travel to people's homes and they'd get to talking and they would share songs and tunes with each other. And it was a two-way street because he had his own repertoire as well, of course. Sometimes he would write down the songs, but sometimes the family might give him a sheet of paper where they had written down a song, or even maybe had saved something from a parent or grandparent. So I want to listen to a little bit of him singing "Farewell, My Dearest Dear," and he's actually singing this very version that we're looking at the handwriting of, that he collected from Mrs. Lovingood in Cherokee County.
I wish my breast were made of glass and you within it hold your name engraved on my heart in letters wrote in gold. In letters wrote in gold, my love, in letters wrote in gold. Your name engraved upon my heart in letters wrote in gold. Oh, the crow that is so black it surely will turn to white. If I prove false to you, my love, bright day will turn to night. Bright day will turn to night, my love, bright day will turn to night. If I prove false to you, my love, bright day will turn to night.
Lunsford loved doing this. This is a quote from a newspaper column that he wrote in the mid-20s. He said, "As for me, there is more real interest in a lively hunt for folk songs than even in fishing trout or the muskellonge in the Little Tennessee River." I also found some correspondence where he and a person, maybe somebody he hadn't even met yet, would be going back and forth about versions of ballads and songs, and the letter writer might be trying to remember versions of a song that they knew from a parent or grandparent. There was some wonderful letters from the mid-20s with W.J. Morgan, who we're looking at a photograph of him here. He's wearing a tie and a jacket, and also two letters that Morgan wrote to Lunsford. And I was just intrigued by this man. He was working on a road building camp out in the Pisgah Forest, and in his spare time would go looking for ballads himself, as well as Cherokee Native American artifacts in the region. He included a little tidbit in one of his letters that I hadn't heard anywhere else about the song Pretty Sarah, which is very, very commonly sung in this area. But he had said that he had heard that it was a favorite among the Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. And he said that he had heard it said that they sang on the march from morn till night when they were almost dying of homesickness and a desire to see their families. I thought the song is sort of lonesome anyway, and I thought that was a really poignant image. Lunsford was also a fairly well-known performer in the area as early as the early 1900s. And we're looking at a promotional flyer that he circulated for one of his concerts, and it has testimonials from people. He was very good at promotion. If Lunsford was performing at or near a school, it was very common for him to use this as a song collecting moment. So he would often stage contests where he would give a prize to a child that could give him a version of a ballad, especially one that he hadn't heard yet. So we're looking at a newspaper clipping that he saved that reads, "Excellent folk songs secured by B.L. Lunsford as a result of contest held at State Normal School. Miss Mary Powell, a student, wins first prize of $5 in gold. Collection, totals 26 pieces. Miss Ada Moss contributed Mary Golden Tree to the contest." This is in 1925. And if we jump 10 years ahead to his Columbia University recordings, we can hear that he records this very version of the Mary Golden Tree from Miss Ada Moss.
I learned this in the mountains of western North Carolina from a little girl named Ada Moss. There was another ship all on that sea, and the name that they gave it was the Mary Golden Tree, and it sailed on the lowland, lonesome, lonesome, and it sailed on the lonesome sea. There was another ship all on that sea, and the name that they gave it was very Cherokee, and it sailed on the lowland, lonesome, lonesome, and it sailed on the lonesome sea.
He often obtained entire composition notebooks from children, and we're looking at the covers of a couple of those right now. The types of songs in his collection cover an enormous, though not unexpected range: child ballads, American ballads, other folk songs and ballads, play party songs, minstrel songs, a smattering of Civil War songs, other novelty songs. He also collected African-American spirituals, not other kinds of songs, but spirituals. And of course, quite a few popular sentimental songs of the day. My personal favorite entry for winner of most lugubrious title ever, "There is room in my coffin for your picture." So his musical legacy in terms of the folk festivals, Lunsford was hugely influential in the folk festival movement in the United States. He started the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival in 1928 in Asheville, which was perhaps the first festival of its kind. The festival continues to this day, and it was a chance for professional and non-professional mountain musicians, dancers, and ballad singers to perform for crowds of thousands. Lunsford also worked closely with Sarah Gertrude Knott, who was the founder of the National Folk Festival in 1934. He advised her closely on that festival and also festivals after that. He actually got together a group of musicians to go to the first National Folk Festival, and this is a few of the musicians on stage in 1934. A few themes popped out to me, running a little bit short of time, so I'm going to go through them a little bit quickly, but and this is probably because of my background in Appalachian Studies, which I teach, but a few themes that connected the music of the Southern Mountains to some larger historical themes. The first of those was a context for traditional music. Lunsford was very aware that traditional music was threatened by the loss of the context in which traditional music generally functioned. And I think that he was aware of the need to foster the festival as a way to create a new context in which those traditions could flourish. He also really worked to foster performers and to nurture people. I wanted to look at just a quick clip of a 9th generation ballad singer. This is just last year at a festival that I direct here at Mars Hill University. This is a 9th generation ballad singer singing one of the child ballads.
I cannot stay, I dare not stay, for fear 'twill cost my life. For I can tell by your finger rings that you are Lord Daniel's wife, wife that you are Lord Daniel's wife.
Another theme that Lunsford that popped out and that Lunsford was very aware of was the representation of people in the mountains. As everybody's probably familiar with, Southern Appalachia has been and is one of the more stereotyped regions in the United States. And we're probably all familiar with images of people in ramshackle cabins, barefoot, unwashed, unlettered, isolated. As with any stereotype, this is not an accurate portrait of the mountains, but Lunsford was keenly aware of it, and he felt strongly that he didn't want to play into that stereotype, either himself or his performers. So instead of seeing sort of a caricature, overalls, gingham, calico, that sort of thing at his festivals, you just saw people wearing their regular everyday dress. And we're looking at an image of one of his dance teams, or one of the dance teams that performed at his festival. They're not dressed fancy, but the men are wearing suits and ties and bow ties. The women are wearing dresses. This is contrasts with popular images in the media of the mountains. And we're looking at a 1947 article called Folk Singers from Life magazine. A young girl is barefoot, her clothes are dirty, she's sitting on a chair that's falling apart, etc. And indeed, Lunsford himself always was sort of done up to the T in a starched shirt and a tie. His grandson, Ed Heron, told me the other day that you could go over to his house at any time of day and that is how he would be dressed. And we're looking at a picture of him done up in 1949, standing outside of the Cecil Sharp house. The last theme that really popped out to me, I'm going to call "They've All Come to Look for America" with a nod to Paul Simon. There was quite a bit of material, not necessarily generated by Lunsford, but just in things that he had saved, that was using the music of the Southern Mountains to attempt to construct or find an answer to the question, what is America? Who are Americans? a lot discussing the idea that folks in Appalachia were the original Americans, sort of ethnically homogenous European pioneers from the 17th century, frozen in time, and hey, look, their music proves it. Of course, there's quite a lot wrong with that summary that we don't have the time to go into, but at the very least, we can point out that mountain music sounds like it does, not because it was preserved in amber, but because there was vigorous cross-cultural music exchange between African Americans, all kinds of European Americans, and also indigenous people. Lastly, there was quite a bit of material from the mid-30s and early 1940s from the Works Progress Administration, which was one of President Roosevelt's initiatives to help the United States out of the Great Depression. We're looking at a program for a folk music festival from 1936 in Pennsylvania that was organized in cooperation with the WPA. And it's called the March of Freedom, and it says Americans All. And inside this program, it notes that the festival is directed at, quote, building a state of mind and heart which will meet with courage and loyalty any challenge to the American way. Lunsford actually worked for the WPA for a branch of it called the Resettlement Administration. And the Resettlement Administration was actually directed by Charles Seeger, father of Pete, Peggy, and Mike. And the goal of this group was to resettle suffering families into sort of utopian farming communities. And Seeger wanted to foster folk music in these communities. And Lunsford was actually hired to do that. He visited a place called Skyline Farms in Scottsboro, Alabama, to teach mountain music, songs, and dance. And we're looking at a band that had come up to play here in Asheville from Alabama, but from this utopian community in Alabama. So in conclusion, at the end of the day, one is left, at least this one is, with the impression that even though Lunsford's life intersected with larger ideological initiatives, his work in the world of music was really driven by a deep and real affection for place and a real love for the music of that place, and song in particular. And I want for Lunsford to actually close us out himself. These are some words that he included from Longfellow in both of his memory recordings in 1935 and again in 1949.
I breathed a song into the air. It came to earth, I know not where. But long years after, from beginning to end, I found that song in the heart of a friend.
Thank you. And there's a bibliography with some further resources if folks are interested.
Leela, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Yes, I can see lots of people applauding, as do we. Quite a remarkable man and some lovely, lovely singing. So thank you. Well, gosh, on we go. We're going to move on to hear from Margaret Bennett, and she's going to be telling us about another remarkable man and his wife who did a wonderful collection. And if Margaret, you are ready, Martin will do whatever he has to do to get you going.
I think.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can. Okay. Yes.
Right. I presume I'm there. I don't see me, but that's quite all right. I can do without that. I'm going to share my screen with you, so I may as well start to do that right now. And I'll get to the beginning of this slideshow. Whoops, my slideshow start. Okay, so here we are. Dundee's Street Songs, Rhymes and Games, collected by William Montgomery in 1952. And there may be more connections with this paper and Leila's than one might imagine. And I've noticed a few on the way past. I really enjoyed that. Thank you, Leila. William Montgomery is not a name that's terribly well known in Scotland in the world of folk song and folk music. He wasn't a singer, he was a collector, and he was a scholar. But first of all, he was a poet. Born and brought up in Glasgow, he was passionately interested in language and how it was conveyed in poetry and in song, and especially traditional song. His wife Nora was an artist, and this is her painting of him. He met Nora, he became a teacher, he went to university in Glasgow, and he studied English literature, as any literature was called then in the English language. He'd been through the Scottish school system where every school was obliged to teach in the English language. That was the same all over the British Isles, and did a great disservice to dialects. For example, Yorkshire dialect or the Welsh language. People who didn't speak standard English didn't come off terribly well with a great confidence in their own language. And his discovery on going to school in Glasgow was that the minute he was through the door, he had to stop speaking his mother tongue. It was quite a shock because he had two Scots-speaking parents. But of course, he was a bright boy. He fitted in with all of it. And when he went to university to study the medieval literature, he discovered that he could understand this perfectly well, not because he knew the language, but because of his childhood knowledge of Scots. So he began to realize that this is so important to retain those traditional languages, native languages, and no matter where and where you live. And he began to collect, just to note down, he was very familiar, of course, with Robert Chambers' collection of traditional Scottish rhymes from 1826, and began to write them down. And he became a teacher and moved to Dundee, where he met Nora Shargole. She couldn't have been more different. She was born into a much more affluent family in London, and she went to a private boarding school and art school. But she too was interested in collecting songs. She had a Scottish grandmother from Dundee, so she got a job with the D.C. Thompson newspaper, Empire, and she would write down everything she heard. I mention her here because she really is a big part of his work, although she didn't do the audio recording of the collection that we're going to look at today. So here they are working on one of those. And their daughter, Diane, remembers that in the 30s and 40s, he pedaled around Angus on his bicycle collecting songs. And then he got this wire recorder. That, of course, became very much used during the Second World War, but mostly for wiretapping and phone tapping and spying. But Montgomery acquired one pretty well mid-40s, and she says, not graduating to the use of a car or a reel-to-reel tape recorder until the 1950s, when, along with Hamish Henderson, he worked with the American folklorist Alan Lomax. And in fact, Lomax was to spend hours and hours in the home of William Montgomery, asking him about the ballads. Lomax's own notes tell us this. Lomax is one of the few scholars who totally acknowledged Montgomery for the scholar that he was. He seems to vanish in Scotland. He vanishes in ballad scholarship, except in the footnotes. And you'll find him in the well-known books that are really, if you like, the tools of the trade: Bronson, Porter, Buck and Gower, and Emily Lyle. Emily Lyle is the only one who actually acknowledges him in her text. And she says in her very, very well-known collection, the Crawford Collection of Ballads and Songs, the pioneering bibliographical work done by William Montgomery was the primary source for her work. You'll find him in a footnote in one of David Buchan's books when he talks about Mrs. Brown of Falkland, and the footnote is William Montgomery. And in fact, I hesitate to tell you, take a look at the PhD and then go back to the book. You'll get quite a surprise. Montgomery did a PhD in 1953. That was when it was submitted and completed. But he did it under the coercion of two people who founded, or were planning to found, the School of Scottish Studies. And the two professors, Professor of Linguistics and one, and Professor McIntosh as well, they admired his work. And when he submitted it to Edinburgh and the school was founded, they no longer needed him. He had a job anyhow in Dundee, and there he worked, teaching, and he took a year out to record, to audio record. After his time with Lomax, he bought a ferrograph tape recorder and headed off to schools. They had, however, already published 2 or 3 books by then. And in the preface, they say, these rhymes should precede the pleasure derived from the more mature folk songs and ballads. Indeed, their fundamental quality attunes young ears to all poetry. Montgomery disagreed strongly with Professor Child's selection of ballads. And in fact, Leila's paper, I thought it was quite exciting when you pointed out that he collected a ballad from a young girl in 1926. Well, Montgomery noted that none of Child's sources were from children, and said there must be children who are singing these ballads. So he determined to actually audio record that, not just to write it down, but to audio record. And so off he set with his tape recorder in 1952. Meanwhile, they'd already published these, and not a publisher in Scotland would touch any of their books. They were published in London with the backing of Walter de la Mare, who wrote and said, these rhymes make my one drop of Scottish blood dance. Know what I wrote to him. And I mentioned, again, Leela mentioned the WPA. How do I know about him? Well, from a man who worked with the WPA collecting in Kentucky, in New York, and who was an old soldier and had come to Edinburgh in the 40s during the war, Herbert Halpert. And the occasion was, this is Halpert collecting, by the way, in Kentucky in the 30s. Halpert was my own professor of folklore. And when the Opie's book, the well-known collection, of course, that we all know and love, came out in the was it 58, was on our reading list. And he read a piece out and he said, well, actually, they weren't the first. Willie Montgomery was out collecting long before they were, and that's all right, but you have to know about him, and he set me to read the whole lot. Of course, I was delighted to find the audio recordings in the archive of the School of Scottish Studies, and there they have lain for 69 years. So what do they sound like? Well, pretty good, his tape recorder. And he was looking for Scots, but this is a curious mixture of the song that most people know. It's in English, and then it jumps into Scots. It's got verses that, if anybody else knows them, do join in, but here we are. I'll let you hear them.
Queen Mary, my age is 16. My father's a farmer in yonder green. He's plenty of money to dress me in silk, but the money lad, he'll tap me a while. No, not tap me, no, not tap me a while, no, not tap me a while. I said to myself, what a bonny wee lass. My hands by my side and I gave a ha-ha. The bonny lad, he'll tap me a while. Na, tap me a while, na, tap me a while. The bonny lad, he'll tap me a while. Morning I rose and I had a wee son. I said for the doctor, the minister come. He christened my baby and gave it his name. His name was Patty-Pata. Na, tap me a while, na, tap me a while. The bonny lad, he'll tap me a while.
Interestingly, half the song is English, half the song is Scots, and then they've got the naughty verse at the end, which doesn't seem to appear in any of the printed versions I've come across, in Scottish collections at least. But to hear them sing and play as real Dundonians for the Hill tune, which was they were children who lived in the nearby tenements, which are now sadly no more. But here they are. The bum bee stung me. I think it probably speaks for itself. And this is one of the drawings by Les McConnell, who's an artist who lives in Fife, and he thought it would be fun to draw some of these. This is the Dundee Law, actually. So here we are.
Somebody can tell me, oh the bumby, somebody can tell me, oh the bumby, somebody can tell me, for Mary lasses in Twatley.
You'll hear May we lassie. Well, if there's any word in the whole language that gives away the Dundonian, it must be this one, May for my. And this is, I think this is a delightful one. My lad's a Terry. A Terry is a soldier in the Territorial Army. They had a big, huge barracks in Dundee. In fact, it was a huge military base. And that area of Angus and the whole of these adjacent areas as well are areas where they recruited a lot of soldiers for the Black Watch. They may start off in and they also the British Medical Corps trained there. So he was a sort of upper class boyfriend to have. He's a toff, he's a Terry, he's a toff.
He said he loves me, I know he does. Melod's a Terry song.
And so on. Whoops. And so on. On the subject of army and soldiers and so on, they sang a song which they called The Banks o' Aberfeldy. And it would be quite understandable if people thought, oh, well, this must be the birks of Aberfeldy that Burns referred to. Well, there's no such place as the banks of Aberfeldy that I've ever been able to come across. The birks, yes, but no the banks. And there's not even a river, the Aberfeldy. But this particular song is quite intriguing. I'll play a fair bit of it, and I've put the text up because it's not always easy to tell what they're singing. But here we are, and it goes at various tempos.
Father, mother, may we go, may we go, may we go. Father, mother, may we go, not to Aberfeldy.
I'll hasten it on. So they hop, skip, and off you go, off you go. And then you come to this bit. You didn't ken what we saw on the banks of Aberfeldy. We saw a lad that danced in his kilt. Well, Aberfeldy is the hometown of the Black Watch. We saw a lad that danced in his kilt, on the banks of Aberfeldy. But then the next line, now, we're talking about what? Somebody will have to shout out the distance between Aberfeldy and Dundee. It's not seriously long in today's terms, but then, well, you didn't ken what we got. We got a kiss and a golden ring on the banks of Aberfeldy. Make of it what you will. So here we are. And I'll go on to the next one. This particular one, Bell-Bottom Trousers, it's a very well known. It was a hit song in the 40s, and it's attributed to a Lithuanian American by the name of Mo Jaff. Recorded in 1944. I'm just going to check by Connie Boswell. It was first of all issued in a military, for military personnel only, and then it was issued in Britain as well. The big recording, which some of you might even have on 78 of your collectors, was by Guy Lombardo and the Royal Canadians. But here we have it in Dundee, Bell-Bottom Trousers. Whoops, go back.
They'll do, but it's bell-bottom trousers, coat of navy blue. Bell-bottom trousers, coat of navy blue. She loves a sailor and she loves her too. When they get married, oh, what thing they'll do, but it's bell-bottom trousers, coat of navy blue.
It's fairly straightforward words, and it's more or less the words on the album or the 78 RPM record that was issued. I thought I'd have a look to see what Steve had to say about this in his Roud collection, and sure enough, it's there. And of course, there are a few versions thrown in from the likes of oh gosh me, I think Cyril Tawney had one. There's a sailor song, and it's got several really bawdy versions. So I wonder what in the world Mo Jaff was up to when he wrote it. What did he? And lo and behold, he got the original from a collection from the WPA, again, that same collection. And would you believe the collector was Herbert Halpert, the one who told me about the Montgomery, rather a lovely circular thing. And he says Halpert says in his notes, he cut the disc on a 12-inch 78 acetate disc and it's in Indiana University. This is in 1930 something, and he said he's got the words, of course, and he classifies it as a bawdy sailor song. So the cleaned up version is what came out on record, and here we have it in Dundee, alive and well among the children. Back to the Dundonian and the sense of place. Start, as anybody who bounces a ball in Scotland knows, means bounce, 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 bounce the ball. 20 lasses on the law, that's the Dundee law, which is a very wonderful dramatic landscape feature in Dundee. So here they are in their own inimitable way, bouncing a ball.
Stop, stop, ba, ba, 20 lasses on the lawn, no lad among the man. Stop, stop, ba, ba, stop, stop, ba, ba, 20 lasses on the lawn.
And so on. They talk about hand-eye coordination and everything else, and I'm sure the children didn't give it a thought. But back to the question at the beginning, did he ever find any child ballads? Well, yes, he did. Not a lot, but this was one that he got from a 12-year-old boy in Dundee at that school. And interestingly, this boy had actually moved to Dundee from an orphanage near Glasgow. And this was one of the songs that he sang, and his friends all joined in with him.
Was a lady dressed in green, poor Lady Lila. There was a lady dressed in green, down by the greenwood side. She had a baby in her arms, poor Lady Lila. She had a baby in her arms, down by the greenwood side. She had a bread knife sharp and long, poor Lady Lila. She had a bread knife sharp and long, down by the greenwood side. She stuck it in.
And so on. I should go back though and tell you that, I'm sure some of you will be very familiar with the version that came out in the mid-60s, sung by the Dubliners, Will You Wire, and everybody was going around singing that version, which of course is a Dublin street song version of The Cruel Mother, child number 20. So he did in fact find a few. The entire collection of the 1952 tapes that are in the School of Scottish Studies and now, of course, digitized, and you've been listening to them, there are 48 items that he recorded from that school just in one afternoon. And who knows how many more there were. I've always felt that Montgomery should be better known. He should be better known among scholars, among singers. He should be better known in Scotland. He's much better known in America, where in fact his PhD was eventually published in a series of articles in a journal published in North Carolina. And it's been of use to so many scholars of ballad. But this is possibly the first audio collection to be published of the Montgomerys. They tried themselves to interest publishers in the audio, and there was no interest whatsoever. However, the big glimmer of hope came in the 1980s, and both of them had actually, well, they were up in years then. William was over 80 and Nora almost 80. And Canongate Publishing said, yes, they would issue a cassette of these. But the disappointment was they decided they would have them properly done. So they appointed two Scottish actors, well-known, loved Scottish actors, who appeared in the sort of local soap that everybody knew, and one play called The Steamy, and they recited them, and they also told some of the stories they collected, which in a way missed William Montgomery's point, to listen to the language and the sound of the children themselves. That is the mother tongue, and whether it's Dundee or Sheffield or Manchester or wherever it is, that mother tongue it's called the mother tongue because that's what it is. And so he didn't ever see the Scots language recognized in any way. But now that this is going to actually, tomorrow is going to come out in a book, a collection of them. And there's a CD, it's going to be illustrated by Les McConnell, as I mentioned. And inside it is a CD of the 48 tracks. There's also a version of the book with just downloads. So if anybody's interested in it, I can send you a link to come to the launch tomorrow night, if you'd like to. By the way, Steve, I have to confess, this was not in the pipeline when you asked me if I would like to do a little paper on. I said, I'd love to do one on them, and it was still my lockdown project. Anyhow, it's maybe not finished. It started at the very least. There's lots more, but I should maybe stop there and leave lots of time for everybody else and for questions. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Margaret. Again, another wonderful talk, one that I enjoyed very much indeed. A fascinating man at a fascinating time, bit of a, you know, going out there and doing what he really cared about. So thank you. Don't forget, everybody, there will be questions at the end, so please store those questions up for us. We're going to move on now to Steve Gardham, who is going to tell us a little bit more about his own history of song collecting and some of the people that he met and knew. So we'll switch over imminently.
Okay. Have you got me?
We got you.
Right, okie dokie. I'd like to link up with Margaret and Leila for their excellent presentations. With Margaret particularly mentioned the Opis, and when I did my last talk, I left out a very important section, really, because I was talking about the influences on me coming to be a folk song collector, and one very important one was that when I was a teenager, about the age 12, and it's 1959 was the year, I used to go into the local library and spend a lot of time in there, and one of the books that struck me very, very much was the Opis, the Law and Language of School Children. A great big influence on me. I immediately went out with a notebook and started writing down. I read it from cover to cover, and then I went right home and started writing out all the rhymes and the games and everything that I knew as well. And then later in my own, when I became a teacher, it inspired me to collect lots and lots of stuff, and I got lots of stuff from the children in the schools that I was teaching in, and I ended up with a great big suitcase full of manuscripts and things. And Steve Roud was the benefit of all that when he produced his excellent book, The Law of the Playground. So that was just a little thing from last time. Moving on to the three old salts then. We have, I really need to give a bit of geography, because we've got a lot of people from over the pond here who won't know very much about the maritime things in connection with Hull itself. Hull is an East Coast seaport, but unlike the ports further around the coast like London, Portsmouth, Bristol and Liverpool, the trade was mostly not across the pond. It was with places like the continent, the Baltic, Scandinavia, and Hull is also famous for its whaling industry from about circa 1750 to about 1850, taking the whaling fleets up to Baffin Island and Greenland, that area. And then in 1850, when the whaling sort of ran out, they moved over to trawling, deep sea fishing, and Hull became one of the largest fishing ports in the world. From the period from about 1850 right up to about the 1970s, when the Cod War started and that sort of thing. That brings me on to some of the things that our friend Bert, and I hope Brian is listening to this, because it's another little anecdote about Bert Lloyd. Hull has a famous maritime museum, and Bert in the 50s made the comment that, like the New Bedford American whaling ports, they had lots of journals, whalemen's journals, but in fact that's not true. What they did have with songs in, he actually said that they had songs in, like the Gail Huntington ones at New Bedford and Nantucket. They had none. What they had in Hull was whalemen's logs, lots and lots of whalemen's logs, but all they have is like telling you what the weather's like on a daily basis and what whales they've caught and that sort of thing. They do have half a dozen sort of photocopies of private journals, but I've searched through all of them and there's no songs at all. So very little in the way of traditional song comes out of Hull. There's nobody collecting songs in the area until we started in the 1960s. And out of the first people who I collected, I only had a very, very cheap tape recorder and no transport. And so I started my collecting in Hull itself. As you know from the last time, with my own family, but also going around the local pubs and getting to know various people. I went to I got interested in sort of traditional folk music through the Watersons, and heard of as well. And Jim's father-in-law, he had family connections as well. His father-in-law played fiddle tunes, and his gran also sang a few songs for us. And she told us about an old seaman called Jack Smith, who was 84. And we went and recorded in the June of 1967. He was the first of the 3 old salts that I recorded, and we went round to his house. He had sailed in square-rigged coasters for Thompson's schooners on boats by the name of the Black Cat and the Cock of the North, taking coal down to Fowey, coastal cargoes, and bringing China clay back. One of the songs that he sang to us, we already were aware of, because Louis Killen was a big friend of the Watersons, and he was coming to Hull a lot and singing songs. And one of the songs he sang was the Bold Princess Royal. On the 14th of February, we sailed from the land on the Bold Princess Royal, bound for Newfoundland. We had not been sailing scarce days 2 or 3, when the mate from the masthead strange colours did see. Words to that effect, and that was the tune that, roughly the tune that Louis sang to us, and the one we were all familiar with us, and some of our floor singers had also started singing that song, that version as well. But Jack Smith sang to us a version of the Bold Princess Royal, and he sang it to a version of the Villikins tune, the very well-known Villikins tune. See if I can give a bit of that. I can't actually play the recordings. Well, I can play the recordings, and I will say that all of the recordings we made are on the British Library Sound Archive, so you can listen to all of them there, but the quality of the recording isn't good enough for this particular presentation. So I'll just have a go at singing the first verse, how he sang it. On the 14th of February, we sailed from the land, the Bold Princess Royal, bound for Newfoundland, with 40 brave seamen in our ship. So boldly from the eastward to the westward sailed we. So quite a different tune to Louis' tune. He also sang for us Rolling Home, Blow the Man Down, A Roving, 10,000 Miles Away, a version of The Wild Rover, which we got lots of versions in the East Riding, Kitty Wells, an American song, Tom Bowling, strangely enough. The only one of Dibdin's songs that we ever collected, and I collected 3 or 4 times, was Tom Bowling. Bell-Bottom Trousers, which has already been mentioned by Margaret, he sang that as well. Probably his was probably a pre-war version, though not the pop version. And another one that he sang was known as the on broadsides, known as the Grimsby Fisherman's song. The tune and the chorus actually came from America, from New York, and it's a song called the Knickerbocker Line from the 1860s. And the song spread into the sea community. The Knickerbocker Line wasn't a naval line at all. It was a line, a cart, a land transport cart running along the coast in New York. And the tune and the chorus spread to the Great Lakes and became the cruise of the Bigler, and it also spread to Britain and became the Doggerbank. And this is his version of the verse and a chorus. Our skipper, he's a rooster, and he likes a pot of good ale. Our second edition has been in prison, he's seen the inside of a jail. Our third Andy's a bush ranger, come from the African wilds. And our dirty old cook, you can tell from his look, he's been out on the tiles. What clipper, our pipe, your jovial crew. Give her the sheets and let her rip with the boys to see you through. You ought to see us run in the passage soaring free, our passage from the Dogger Bank to Great Grimsby. Well, as I say, with no transport and one of the places that we thought we'd try, there was still in the 60s, there was still plenty of singing pubs in Hull where they had an old upright piano and they'd get somebody who could go on the piano and play. And one of those pubs was on the street where Hull Fair takes place, called the George Hotel. And there we came across a chap called Ted Calcott, who was a Londoner, but had come to Hull in 1899, and he was 86 years old, and he'd sailed the topsail riggers on the Argentine meat run to Buenos Aires, as he called it, Buenos Aires. And he, apart from the songs that he sang and the shanties that he sang for us, he also told us some quite realistic sounding as well, some stories of cannibalism and Shanghaiing on the Barbary coast, which he said he'd experienced himself. He sang some of the similar songs to Jack Smith's songs. He sang Rolling Home, Whiskey Johnny, Goodbye Fare You Well, Sacramento, Shenandoah. His version of Blow the Man Down was a Ratcliffe Highway one, and he described what Ratcliffe Highway was like in his youth to us, with all the ships along the Thames. He gave us a description of the story of Pocahontas, of course, which is what Shenandoah, or his version of Shenandoah, was about, or that's what he believed anyway. Except he said that she was buried on Canvey Island, but actually she was buried in Gravesend, not very far away, on the opposite side of the Thames. He also sang us quite a few Cockney musical songs from the 1890s. At Trinity Church, I Met My Doom, While London Sleeps, No More Up at Covent Garden, The Pilot, which is a fairly well-known one, which we got quite a lot of versions of that, and Just One Girl. And the song Just One Girl, an old musical song, he said the trawler skippers used to try and play that on their whistles coming up the river, up to the River Humber, but it got banned because it was interfering with the signals. Right, now that's our second Old Salt. Ted, of course, was a seasoned Cape Horner, as was our next one. I got in touch with the next chap due particularly through a local radio appeal. I'd been playing some recordings of some of the other people on local radio. In fact, then reel-to-reel thing that cost $5 was in a totally opposite end of the market. You were state-of-the-art recorder after that, for a while anyway. And from the appeal on local radio, we got to know a Captain Norman Yates, who was 78 at the time. This was in 1970. And he made some of his own recordings. Oh, we've got a picture of a Christmas tree. That's good. With a picture of a Christmas tree there, Martin. On my, well, that's what's showing up on mine anyway. Right. Yeah, so Captain Norman Yates, he accompanied himself on a banjo and sang lots of songs from his early days. He had, well, actually what I'll do is I'll read you out a little description of him here. Born at Newcastle, he first went to sea aged 14 aboard the bark Kildalton and was a seasoned Cape Horner. He was later an officer with the Wilson Line. He was a lieutenant R&R in the Great War in command of an anti-submarine vessel, joined the Humber Pilot service in 1922 and was active in the 1939-45 war. Okay. That really gives a sort of background of his early time when he was actually learning his songs. He sang songs like Rio, Shanties, A Roving, Blow the Man Down, Whiskey Johnny, Drunken Sailor, and a song that's not really a shanty, but it's a bit of a song called No More Pulling on the Lee Fore Brace. Have we got that, Martin? Hello. He also sang for us Spanish Ladies, Rolling Home, Sacramento again. And then he also sang this following song, Roll the Cotton Down, which actually goes to the Roll Alabama Roll tune, or that's the shanty that I know to this tune, but so it's quite an interesting one, Roll the Cotton Down.
Port watch, get the anchor. Starboard watch, man topsail halyards, hoist away.
Yeah, he also sang Blow Boys Blow, Underneath Her Apron, and the Sailing Ship Alphabet. He sang a version of that as well. How are we doing for time, Martin?
You have, well, another 4 minutes exactly, but okay. A bit of leeway.
I'll just finish off with one of his songs then, in that case. Norman Yates sang for us Mary was the maiden in cap and gown so neat. Mary paid the penalty for being most indiscreet. It wasn't by the butler, the milkman or the sweep, but by a jolly sailor man who roams the ocean deep. Mary, what have you got beneath your apron? It's nothing, sir, it's nothing, sir, it's nothing, sir, said she. It's my apron strings I got the other day. But fear the shy should soil them, don't you know? I took them neatly underneath me apron. And there you go, we'll finish there then.
Thank you very much. That was another excellent talk. Some fascinating people you got to know in your, I think it's your youth, isn't it? Or at least,
yeah.
Well, it obviously wasn't misspent in the least. So thank you. That was another brilliant talk. So,
are you ready for me?
Yes, Marge, we are ready now. So whenever you'd like to kick off.
Right. Well, mine is maybe a bit of a different emphasis. A few sessions ago, we talked a lot about field work, about the challenges and the dilemmas. So I thought here I would talk about and interrogate the notion of otherness. And I gave this, or versions of this talk, at the American Anthropological Association meetings in, I think, 93, and then in 2019 at the American Folklore Society. There won't actually be songs in this presentation. In subsequent talks, there will be plenty of songs and and possibly some visuals. So here goes. It is generally assumed that the ethnographer's talk is to study and make sense of the other, one perceived to be from a different culture and possessing an ethos and worldview that is radically different from that of the ethnographer. The corollary is that the ethnographer, or if you want to say folk song documenter, represents the other to those being studied, and that those being studied are attempting to make sense of the ethnographer, the unbidden other in their midst. Sense-making involves attempts at placing the other in understood categories and roles, the better to feel in control of the social situation and at impression management, so that both field worker and interlocutor engage in carefully engineered disclosure and concealment, ensuring that each will appear in the eyes of the other in a light favorable to the ends each has. So I'm going to now talk about my how my interlocutors and I, a blind ethnographer in a border community in Northern Ireland, manipulated our statuses as other, thus giving voice to mutual discomfort at our inability to easily make sense of one another. This manipulation of identities closely parallels the manipulation of identities that constantly took place in the politico-religious sphere. When I moved into the community in July of 1978 and made myself an all too visible presence, virtually everybody wondered what this strange being, a blind American woman, Jewish folklorist, was doing there. For my part, I was trying to come to grips with an alien cultural environment with politico-religious complexities that I had very little understanding of, and not to mention proper etiquette and a dialect of Hiberno English that was incomprehensible to me, especially when spoken by drunken men with no teeth. I vividly recall, and I should say this was very painful to me at the time, but in retrospect, pretty hilarious, but I'll let you judge. I vividly recall my first full afternoon at McQuillan's pub, where the bulk of the unplanned sing-songs took place. Very revealing interchange, conflict management strategies were being played out before my very ears in the form of singing and joking, but at the time I was severely handicapped, as it were, in deciphering what was going on, not merely because of my blindness, but because I was totally out of my element. My playing the role of the overly zealous interviewer in eliciting songs and information on where singers had learned them had a jarring effect, so that I missed significant interchanges. Also, my inexperience with the dialect, plus my ignorance of Northern Ireland, led me to misinterpret questions that were addressed to me or not to respond at all. So naturally, people concluded that I was deaf. My tape recorder picked up a revealing interchange when I went to the toilet. And it took me years to decipher it, and I can't even be completely sure either all these years later of all the words or sometimes even who spoke them, but I'll read this. Jimmy, she's a Yankee. Charlie, eh? Jimmy, she's a Yankee. Two voices in sequence. She's a Yankee. Francie, she doesn't give a damn about, there, Jimmy, about our feelings. Patron, you're right there. Patron, the wee lassie, she's Charlie, blind. Francie, and she's the hearing of a stone. Charlie, eh? Ned, that tape's still on. Terry, she'll never know. Charlie, leave her there. Patron, she lives around beside you. Terry, she's from New York. She's looking for old songs. She's doing some kind of a course. Several seconds of crosstalk. Jimmy, I met her a year ago. Charlie, I met her coming out of Francie. Why don't you sing her some songs? Terry, eh? Francie, your football songs. Why don't you sing her a song for the tape? Terry, I can't talk. Charlie, I heard more songs than Halpin has, but that's all right. Francie, the wee girl's coming into the room, unintelligible. And remember, give her special, and I think the word was treatment. Charlie, she's blind, how can that be? Jimmy, by God, I have a record. Francie, she's on to you boy, you. Patron, come on, Jimmy. Jimmy, but, Francie, you boy, ya, she's on to you. Jimmy, 5,000 pounds for a fucking record. Patron, responding to an unintelligible question. That's my business. Laughs. Jimmy, I knew when. Francie, see, Jimmy, she's around there. Jimmy, unintelligible. Francie, and she'll push herself to you. Jimmy, she's blind, and I'll try anyway to cover. Francie, and she'll push herself to you. Jimmy, unintelligible. Ned, come on ahead, this way, you girl, you. Jimmy, I knew I'd heard her coming. I sit down, and Francie buys me a drink. Just as I found the milieu of the pub incomprehensible, the men found this strange blind woman, who, also deaf and dense as they thought it, and also possibly with motives that were suspect. Francie, Ned, and others colluded in giving me that special treatment and humored me. I am glad to say that over time things got much better, and I developed warm and affectionate relationships with quite a few people. Yet there were those who remained suspicious. The difficulty lay in the fact that villagers could not easily place me in pre-existing categories or roles. The only experience that locals had had with Americans was with soldiers stationed at Crum during World War II and with quote-unquote returned Yanks, people who had been born in the area, had gone to the U.S., and had returned to Newtonbutler with relative wealth and also braggadocio. By this definition, according to one man, I was not a Yank, and another man said that I was the best damned Yank he'd ever met. To folk in Newtonbutler, the stereotype of the Jew was of crafty miser, and to call one a Jew was an epithet indeed. My being an independent woman who spent so much time in the pubs meant that I was a particular threat to some men's wives, because these women rarely accompanied their husbands to the pub. The category folklorist or ethnographer was likewise an unfamiliar one to Newtonbutler residents. Whereas many communities in Ireland, both north and south, had been visited by collectors from the Irish Folklore Commission, Newtonbutler had been virtually untouched by these visits, except by a 2-day visit from staff at the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum. The idea that someone could come to the village, just hang around, and seek people to interview seemed incomprehensible, and my real motives were a constant source of speculation. Finally, as might be expected in a remote rural community, people had little contact with blind folk, whether fully functional members of society or otherwise. Comments about my blindness were generally from women who remarked that I was very brave to come all the way to Newtonbutler on my own. My response was invariably nonchalant. I was no braver than anyone else. One man expressed the idea that I was not quite whole and should seek a remedy, and he twice offered to take me to a folk healer, a seventh son of a seventh son. This invitation I politely declined. Children were curious and were thoroughly delighted when I showed them how to write their names in Braille. My blindness, as well as the other characteristics that I mentioned, made me a novelty, so that the local newspapers and even BBC Ulster saw me as news. I invariably tried to deflect the interviewer's attention back to Newtonbutler rather than myself as a subject of interest. Above all else, I was a stranger, although, as the ethnographers Karp and Kendall said, idiot might have been a better analogy. But stranger is what people called me for much of the time that I resided in Newtonbutler. I was one who could not quite be trusted and was kept at a safe distance by many. Once, at a dinner for the darts team, I asked an acquaintance if I could sit with him. Sure, he said. I wouldn't want people to think you were a stranger. After having been in the village for some time and participating, as I was expected to do, in pub sing-songs, I sang a song that I had learned from one of the community's best singers. Not bad, for a stranger, was one man's response. My status as a stranger, symbolized most saliently by my blindness, meant that people were always trying to fit me into roles with which they were familiar, creating the illusion that they knew what I was up to, while I, for my part, deliberately strove not to conform to stereotypes. The paradoxical attempts at masking and sense-making meant that we were often engaged in palpable gamesmanship. Not surprisingly, my blindness was a central feature of this gamesmanship. When people realized that I was going to be in the community for quite a while, they saw me, and they just saw me hanging around. Many speculated that I was a spy, and I was variously accused of being a spy for the CIA, the IRA, and the British. One day, I was sitting in McQuillan's when a man from the nearby town of Lisnaskea, and therefore an outsider, entered. He began by breaking the taboo against asking directly about people's politico-religious affiliations. Are you SDLP, which was then the Catholic, it was the Social Democratic and Labor Party. Are you SDLP? No. Are you a unionist? No. Finally, I said, I'm a registered Democrat in the United States. At this point, my inquisitor decided that I was really a British spy. And further, he averred, my blindness was really a cover. I was quite enjoying this ludicrous interchange because anyone who was seriously worried that I was a spy would have killed me first and asked questions later. Others in the pub, however, were becoming quite flustered, and the barman told him that if he didn't shut up, he'd have to leave. Ah, be quiet, one man exclaimed. She's the best wee lassie in Newtown. So, for the moment, I was not a stranger. For my part, I was determined not to conform to stereotypes, and I had at least one willing cohort. After settling in for a 3-month stint with the West family, I established a joking relationship with Celia, the 15-year-old. Among other things, we would play tag on the street, during which she would grab my cane and run. Outraged adults, who were under the impression that Celia was being mean, made haste to complain to Cecilia's mother, only to be told, they carry on like this all the time. These anecdotes illustrate how the residents of Newtonbutler and I manipulated the identities of stranger, community member, of the blind spy who had the potential to reveal dangerous things, and insider-outsider. Our gamesmanship involved playing to the paradoxical stances of engrossment and distance. While my blindness was not the sole or determining characteristic that made me an outsider that must be kept at a distance, it was part of a gestalt and served to foreground my ambivalent status in the community. Any ethnographer in an alien community shares much in common with a person with a disability. Both the ethnographer and the person with a disability are, quote-unquote, the other and considered not quite whole. The ethnographer, by virtue of not being born in the culture and therefore lacking requisite cultural knowledge, and the person with a disability by virtue of a physical lack, which is assumed to have cultural implications. Sociologist Irving Goffman observed that stigmatized persons, including those with disabilities, by virtue of being the other, are sometimes stimulated to become observers and critics of the social scene, which is also true of ethnographers. Both ethnographers and persons with disabilities are potentially threats. In the case of the ethnographer, the threat is direct because he or she could write ethnography which could be damaging to the image a community would like to maintain. In the case of a person with a disability, whether he or she plays that part, there is always the chance that he or she could throw into relief deep-seated fears on the part of the quote-unquote normals, and that's in quote from Goffman, not to mention blatant inequities. It is understandable that my position as a blind ethnographer and an unknown outsider was troublesome in a border community in Northern Ireland. All too often, unknown outsiders wreaked death in this volatile war zone, and it certainly was that in the 70s. It was also assumed that even your neighbor, quote unquote, on the other side of the house in the politico-religious sphere would be loyal to his or her own side and could well have been called on to kill for their allegiances. So you could never be too sure of your neighbor, even though you had to get along for sheer survival. As I've written elsewhere, joking abounded when Catholics and Protestants got together in mixed company. Thus, Charlie Mulligan, a Protestant, would dare Jimmy Halpin, a Catholic, to sing the sash, which was the orange song par excellence. Jimmy would comply, but would have the last word by getting in his own partisan taunts. The manipulation of identities, sense-making, and mask-making may be well-nigh universal, but in rural Newtonbutler, such tendencies exhibited among Catholics and Protestant neighbors between interlocutor and ethnographer provided artful means of surviving and even thriving. And that's my talk.
Thank you again, Marge. That was absolutely fascinating. A whole realm of the interface between collector, observer, and the people of a place. That was really amazing. So thank you, and thank you indeed to everybody who's offered talks for this afternoon. Each of them was absolutely wonderful. I did enjoy them all. So, we have, I can see 2 questions already, which is wonderful. We're going to take questions first from Derek and then from Malcolm. And then Conrad, if you would like to be ready with your wire recorder, are you able to take about 5 minutes, Conrad? That would be great.
No more.
But no more, Martin says. So Derek.
Oh my God. No.
Right,
Okay.
so Derek first, and then Malcolm, and then we'll come to you, Conrad.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to everybody. My questions to Leila, really. Thank you, Leila. I enjoyed what you had to say about Lunsford. I was, however, reminded of some of his politics. Guy Carawan and Frank Hamilton and Rambling Jack Elliott all went to visit him in the 1950s and were grilled about whether or not they were commies. And the year before, Dick Greenhouse, who some of us will remember visiting the UK, him and his trio were introduced at the festival by Lunsford as 3 Jews from New York City. And Dave Van Ronk called him a racist, anti-Semitic, white supremacist. Just wondered if you had any comments on these.
Well, yes. He was definitely very conservative. So I am not an expert on the man. I mean, I've been going through his boxes, and I know some of his family members. you know, what I found in his collection, so, I mean, most sort of the early folk festivals, old time music, mountain music, is sort of a reproduction of this notion of whiteness. Absolutely. And there were people who were very intentional architects of that, like Henry Ford. I did not find anything in the papers that indicated, you know, Lunsford sort of being an architect of it, as opposed to a reproducer of it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've heard what you're saying, and I've heard those stories, and he definitely was quite conservative, and was not into using, you know, folk music as protest or you know, to seek social justice and that kind of thing. But I didn't see a giant like embrace of ideology, although I do see some reproductions of it, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you. Shall we move on now, please, to Malcolm?
Well, that's exactly the same question I was going to ask, actually, but Derek's helped me. But I couldn't think where I'd read about it, and it was in the Mayor of McDougall Street by Dave Van Ronk. So thank you, Derek. But what a fantastic afternoon. Such 4 excellent talks, been really brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Conrad, do we have you? Conrad is going to demonstrate the wire recorder that Margaret talked about.
Well, it's always interesting. Can you hear me first?
Yes, Conrad, we can.
Before I go on. Okay, it's always interesting to know what people were dealing with when they were in the field recording. Wire recorders were pretty heavy, much heavier than the cylinder recording devices, which came in a number of sizes themselves. This is pretty heavy. It's all metal. It's Webster machine from Chicago. The most important thing for us today and people in the field is to recognize the medium. It looks like thread. It's really quite absolutely amazing. If you could take a look there, if I put it at an angle, maybe you could see how fine the...
You need to be further from the camera.
Further from the camera, I'm working on it. Well, anyway, that's basically what it looks like. It's very, very, very thin filament, and I can put it in front, and you probably won't even see it. It's so small. I have beard hairs that are larger. I can imagine people picking this up at the thrift shop and thinking nothing of it and transferring it to fishing rod. But it doesn't look like something important. But yet all of these many recordings have been made with it. Machines are available still today. They're available for around $100 to $200, always needing fixed up. They're all electronic with tubes inside. Or for the English, what do they call them? Anyway, you call them something else in England, tubes. You call them tubes. Yep. That's so basically very easy to use, very convenient. I'll turn it on and you'll hear a sermon. Sometimes if there's bad connection on the knobs, which always happens.
And the results today are what?
To be something like this available, it's just absolutely phenomenal. They use them on ships at sea where they would not corrode because they are stainless steel. The Germans beat us because they attached iron to a sheet of paper, strip of paper. But this is much more durable.
But man is turning this back to the blessing from on.
Can you hear the sound?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that is totally remarkable.
It's like recording on your hair, you know?
Yeah.
I can see people who know everything about folklore going into a thrift shop, seeing a pile of these and just not even knowing.
No, I certainly never would. It doesn't look capable of recording. Thank you, Conrad.
There you go.
That's brilliant. Excellent. Thank you. Good.
Glad to help.
We can move on to our next question then, which is, I think it was Brian Peters was next in line.
Hey, Google, shut off basement lights.
All right, turning basement lights off.
Hello. Afternoon all. Four great talks again. I'm going to follow up from actually something slightly related to Derek's question and ask Leela something. I've done quite a lot of work on the Appalachian song collection of Sharp and Carpellies, who incidentally, with reference to Marge's talk, were also mistaken for German spies on two different occasions. Sharp met two black singers who sang in child ballads. He also had in his collection a number of spirituals and some other songs of African-American origin, but he got those from white singers who happened to have worked with black people or attended black churches. So I was wondering, you mentioned that Lunsford had some spirituals in his collection. Did he meet any black singers was question one. And also I'd like to know how we access the archive so I can compare notes on some of the singers with Sharp.
Yeah, he would go to church services and camp meetings, African-American church services and camp meetings. I haven't been through all of the songs, and I am curious if there are any non-spiritual songs in there from African-Americans, you know, or I mean, what happened a lot is because of the way the recording industry was organized, you know, musicians were artificially segregated, you know, white people sang ballads and did string music and African Americans sang blues. You know, this was not accurate, of course, everybody was playing everything. But yeah, what I do know is he definitely went to church services and camp meetings, and he would even perform little or recorded little pieces of sermons that he would hear there. Access the archives. Okay, at the I'll send out the or maybe Martin or Sean will send out the PDF of the talk, and there's links at the end. We have of the songs, we only have a very slim amount of them actually digitized. I mean, there's about 100, but there's thousands more. His scrapbook is digitized though and is fully searchable. But I'd also be happy to, if you email me, you know, maybe I've seen something or could look something up. I interestingly didn't find a lot of overlap of him knowing like the same families that that Sharp had recorded, which was interesting. I've been trying to kind of figure out that overlap by asking people, but that may have been a function of just how the county is laid out and access and stuff.
Sharp did have songs from Nortons and Wallins and Buckners. I know that, but I don't know if those were your examples of Lunsford singers or not.
Yeah, no, he later knew like those folks, you know, in the 60s and 70s, but I couldn't find out if he was aware of them, you know, in the 20s, which is interesting.
Talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Liz Milner, please.
Okay. Basically, I wanted to mention that there is a biography of Lunsford by Loyal Jones. I hope that there are more now, because Loyal is extremely loyal to his subject. The other thing I thought was interesting when I read it was Lunsford, he does talk about how Lunsford was sort of an impresario and a businessman, and he had the habit of certain festivals he would select a few African American performers for, but other festivals would be lily white. So a lot of what he was doing was sort of, he knew who his audience was and what they would tolerate and what they wouldn't. The other thing that in the Loyal Jones biography that was kind of interesting is he hints that Lunsford first became interested in music because of a banjo player who was African American who taught him some things on the banjo, and that was his first real experience of traditional music.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. We have two more hands waiting, so we'll take two more questions before we finish. Marge, would you like to give your
Yes,
question?
yes. Thank you for clarifying, Leila, the notions about. I'm sorry. I think it was Liz who clarified the notion of whether the degree to which Mr. Lunsford was a racist or not. But two very simple questions. In his notebooks, how much context did he note with regard to people's families? Was it just a question of giving dates, titles of songs? Did he do life histories? And then the second question is, was he musically literate, and did his books contain musical notation?
So the collections of songs are actually they're pretty much just the lyrics of songs, and no, not with any back histories. I don't know if that exists somewhere else, but that's not what's in the boxes. There will be attributed often to somebody's name, their age, and where they are, and then the year that it is.
And that's it.
What was the second question? I'm sorry.
Well, I guess you answered that because I wondered about musical notation, but you said no.
Yeah, no. Once in a while, he'll note like the air of the tune, the melody that like, oh, it sounds like this other song, but no notes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we come to our final question, Lisa Null, would you like to ask yours?
Yeah, mine's a little bit more of a comment about otherness that in reference to Marge Steiner's article. I just wanted to say I had a wonderful experiences in the late 80s. I was very much a touring musician and got to know Kenny Goldstein, who was a great collector. And he found that I was singing a lot of songs from New England and Upper New England. And he basically attracted me to become sort of a shill. He had just begun collecting in Newfoundland, and he was very aware of his otherness as a collector. He hadn't lived up there yet, and he had just taken a sabbatical, and he sort of was beginning to know some of the people up there. But he was not a singer. He was very much a scholar. I had not yet gone to folklore school. I think I'd just begun going back to college, but I was very much a singer who had a lot of songs in common with the people he was collecting. So he would bring me along and then try to, and since he was working in communities that didn't have pubs, he would use me as, he would try to generate an induced context. He would try to get people together for a time, or go when they were having some kind of a fundraising for the school. And he would use me as someone who could share. He would, when I first went up there, some of these people had come out to sing at a very local festival, and he brought me in as a guest to sing among them. And then when we went to visit people's houses, he would sort of move into the background as we began sharing songs the way singers do. And although I was another kind of another, I was also another singer with whom they could sing comfortably on sort of equal terms. And we would get into arguments about who did what in the ballads we were singing and what we thought about them. And he would just sort of quietly roll his tape recorder. I know I was followed by Margaret Bennett the next year, and she came in as a singer who was also a folklorist. And I'm wondering, I certainly felt like I had developed very intimate relationships with these people based on the music we shared. And I'm wondering what Margaret felt about that model and how it worked with her.
Thank you, Lisa. Margaret, if you've got a very short reply to that.
Well, yes.
Marge, Margaret, sorry.
To both Marge and Lisa. Well, first of all, I better lay my cards on the table. I've often been the other because I'm from the Isle of Skye and I've collected Newfoundland, North Carolina, Australia. So I've been, but I'm also a disabled person, and very noticeably so at times. So I've been another, and I haven't experienced much of the things that Marge has. And I don't even know that it was because I'm a singer. I went collecting with Kenny, and I didn't attribute either his Americanism or the fact that he's Jewish or his not being a singer to how he related to people. I feel it's a personality thing. Kenny was a very determined collector, and he was so single-minded, he wouldn't even stop for tea when the nice lady who had the kettle boiling for the last 2 hours and kept saying, will you have tea, will you have tea, will you have... He just didn't get it. No, I don't have time. Which is, that to me is a question of acculturation. It's in my culture, if you don't accept the tea or something, they'll be talking about you for days. You wouldn't even have tea. It's a cultural thing. And I think that kind of acculturation is just as important in collecting as anything.
Thank you.
I would agree with that.
You. Thank
I'm
you,
sorry.
Marge.
Did you want me to respond also?
I'm sorry, Marge. I really think that we have to bring it to a close there. But okay. Of course, the chat is still going. It remains to say thank you so much to our 4 presenters. All of those papers were absolutely fascinating. I know I had a few questions that I haven't had a chance to put. We're going to look forward to seeing many of you, and maybe all of you, for the next session, which Steve told you about earlier on. So thank you to our presenters. Thank you to everybody for coming. Have a good next couple of weeks, and we'll see you again. So thank you very much.